Action.
Thanks. But next weekend. Maybe even tomorrow. Stop interrupting. I wasn't. Lucy. Danny. Seriously though, get some good sleep tonight.
Alright, so fun fact. This is actually my second time trying to make this video. First time I tried making it, it was called What I Learned from 5 Years of Amateur Filmmaking. Why didn't I finish it then, you might ask? Well, at the time, I think I just got bored or distracted, but in hindsight, I think the real issue was that, like, on a subconscious level, I realized that I hadn't actually learned enough to talk about yet. So, before we get too far into it, first, I want to give a disclosure. If you're looking for advice on how to break through, on how to get famous, or format your project for IMAX, or, like, get picked up by Netflix, or build an audience, this is not going to be the video for you. But luckily, there are a lot of other great YouTube channels and content creators out there that have already covered those things, which you can check out. The only thing that I can actually speak to with any great expertise is my own experience. And this video, while covering some technical stuff about cameras, editing and mixing, shot type, scripts, whatever, is mostly going to be about the part of filmmaking that I love the most. And that's the, well, I guess you'd call it the heart, wouldn't you? The heartbreak, maybe. The fuck-ups and memories and friends and losses and moments when nothing is going right and moments when everything is going better than you ever could have imagined. Filmmaking is one of the most important things to me, and when I watch filmmaking content from a creative perspective, I often don't really see a whole lot of honest self-reflection from people, just a lot of technical details. And I get it, self-reflection and storytelling from a random guy on YouTube is not always as useful as deciding on what lens is best for your project. But I do think that there's a place for it, and I guess one of those places might be this little corner of my YouTube channel. So, welcome to my experience. I hope it helps you in yours. So, about a backstory. As I write this and now film it and then edit it, the year is 2025 and I'm 25 years old. I've made 13 films that I kind of count, and I've worked on a bunch more for various projects and different things. I made my first short film when I was 15 years old, and as you can expect, it was god-awful, and it really had almost nothing going for it. My grandma, bless her heart, knew I was interested in making movies, and one summer, I guess she was sick of watching me lay around her house playing Xbox and talking about making movies instead of actually doing it, because she got me this little blue digital camera for my birthday, or a back-to-school present or something like that. I don't quite remember. And that camera, a Cam 8MP waterproof digital camera 4x digital zoom and 2.4-inch LCD that can be bought for $9 on eBay, changed everything for me. Now, I had no idea how to actually film anything. I couldn't frame shots or film people, and I didn't have any friends or any ideas. So before I did anything real, I just filmed a bunch of random stuff, and it was all blue, like the camera, because I didn't know what white balance was or how to change it. So then I did a lot of pretending that everything I filmed was blue on purpose and that it was artistic. I didn't have a smartphone, and even if I had those filters and mobile editors and things weren't as ubiquitous yet, because this was pre-TikTok and pre-Musical.ly and CapCut and all that. But the first thing that I actually put to film, which was even close to competent, was a 15-minute short called The End of the Whole Mess, based on the Stephen King story of the same name. I wrote a script for it, not properly formatted of course, just typed in Google Docs, and then filmed the only thing I knew how, the opening credit sequence, which you can see here. I was staying at a resort with my family at the time, and it was kind of close to the end of the season, so I was able to get some cool shots from around the camp that almost sort of conveyed the idea of an abandoned apocalyptic world. Then I took this shot of a local dam because, well, nothing screams the end of the world like a fully functioning man-made structure such as a dam. But it looked cool, so I dropped my footage into Windows Live Movie Maker, slapped a banger Lana Del Rey song over it all like it was a life-saving bandage, watched it 100 times, showed it to everyone in my family, and then didn't really know what to do next. For as simple as I'd made my script, I really didn't know how to actually film any of it. Eventually, I decided to convince my dad that he should play the main character who spends most of his time sitting at a dining room table, and we filmed that with the good old Coolie Cam. But I realized far too late, as in when I put the footage in Windows Live Movie Maker, that my dad was wearing a bright orange shirt which said, "I don't get drunk, I get awesome." And that didn't exactly fit my vibe, and at the age of 15, spending an hour or so to reshoot the scenes with my dad just seemed like too much work. I don't know, the studio wasn't giving us the funds for it. So I gave up for, I don't know, 6 months or something and just did other things. Then in the May of 2015, inspiration somehow struck me again. I busted the Coolie Cam back out, dug up some shop lights, and made sure that my dad was in a nicer shirt this time and reshot everything. I did a better job of it too, even going so far as to create some truly innovative shots, such as this one where my camera is in the fridge and you can hear it get crunched when the door closes. Genius. Then, it being May, I journeyed through the great outdoors, riding my bike for miles around town to take shots of random things I could use in my movie. This church, this stream, this lake, some other stuff. And then I convinced my buddy to do some random nonverbal acting, film me pretending to be a body, some other things, and then I found I only had a few minutes remaining that I needed footage for, and that, hey, using some archive footage from the real world and real world events would help fill those spots up. When it was all said and done, I had my 18-minute movie, and even made a really shitty trailer for it that was mostly text and stock footage. I was really excited about it all, though, and honestly, I was really proud of myself. I made this poster for it, and I remember really debating on whether or not I should put this poster on Facebook. I expected my friends and the kids at school to laugh at me for my movie to, like, get bullied and people call me stupid and stuff, but I decided, whatever, what the hell. I tried, and I'm proud of it, so I'm gonna share my poster. So I did, and the response was actually good. I mean, I didn't, like, get the whole school in an uproar or anything. That would happen a few movies later. But the other kids said the poster was cool, and they asked me about my upcoming movie. Then when I finally posted the finished project on Facebook, my friends were pretty into it. I didn't get any real hate, and they were all supportive of something which, admittedly, wasn't very good. Family, including Dad and Grandma, God bless, were really supportive of it too. And even though they had plenty of constructive criticism, I think they were just, like, impressed that I'd gotten something done. In terms of the technical skills I gained from the whole thing, there weren't a lot. I learned some big ones, like how to change the white balance on my Coolie Cam, that Windows Live Movie Maker was really not the best video editor, and that saving and uploading files takes a really long time. What I learned from this personally was that you can't be afraid of what other people are going to say. Sure, they might laugh at you, but also they might not. And most importantly, they'll never take you seriously if you don't take yourself seriously first. I almost gave up because I just didn't know what to do, but I came back to it after some distance and just kind of cracked the case wide open, like a detective. Sometimes a project isn't right for you at that time, and you need some breathing room. I don't know if my problems are really that psychological. Probably I was just stupid. But when I think about this crappy movie with its few thousand views on YouTube and slew of mean comments it's gathered over the years, that's what comes to mind. Sometimes it's good to take a break and just come back to something when you're ready. It wasn't long after my first project that I had my first major setback. Riding the absolute cinematic high that was my 18-minute slideshow presentation of a Stephen King adaptation, I quickly got to work on my next masterpiece, a 50-something page script called The Blissfully Scorned, about two teenage friends who get separated when one has to move away because his family is abusive. Or something, I don't really remember. Anyway, the friend who stays becomes a successful, blogger, giving self-help advice until he starts getting a hater who dogs on all of his advice and hacks and trolls him online. The two end up meeting virtually and, surprise, the hacker is the other buddy who moved away. Before long, he comes back to town, steals the hero's girl, and causes all sorts of other trouble that culminates in, like, a shootout at the public beach, I think. I don't honestly remember a lot of the details because in a tragic loss for cinema, I never got to finish my movie. Just like the villain in this movie, I had to move away from my hometown when I was 16 at the end of the summer after my sophomore year. I only had about half my script shot before the move, and being beyond sad about moving just like in general, I was pretty devastated about my movie. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't good, but it was something that I was making with my friends, and it meant a lot to me. On a film set, as in life, the most valuable asset is always going to be time, and you never have enough of it. People's time is important, and my friends took the time to drive around with me and film this thing. I felt like I owed it to them to finish it. And even though it wasn't my fault that I had to move, I felt like it was my fault we didn't get it done. And beyond that, I felt like time had been taken from me and from my friends. In short, I felt like a loser, and the Coolie Cam got zipped into a bag and packed away. I was retired. In the last days in my hometown, however, my best friend, Sam, who was in the Blissfully Scorned, got me a going-away present. It was a digital camera, the Samsung WB350F, which now goes for about $150 online, and which I, for obvious reasons, named Sam. But the WB350F was more than just a camera. Sam and some of my other friends had driven around the town with it and taken videos of places they knew were special to me, or where we had gotten into trouble, and also they recorded some goodbyes on the camera. The camera wasn't just a tool for making movies, it was a lifeline. A lifeline to my home, my friends, my memories, the things that were important to me and that I cared about. It meant the world to me. And even though I wasn't ready to believe in myself again quite yet, the camera told me that Sam, my best friend, believed in me. So I moved away from home, and a few months went by before I really used Sam's gift for anything. When I did finally put the digital camera to the test, I still didn't have any new friends in my new town. I was pretty sad and lonely, with very limited resources, so like any smart, stable, and well-adjusted 16-year-old boy, I made use of the few friends that I did still have, my action figures. I wrote a short little script for something called The Unexpected Victim, which was the story of a kid's life told from beginning to end through items on his bedside table. So in the first shot, the table is like blank and there's some heavy-handed religious imagery, but then there's like baby stuff on it, birthday cards, stuffed animals, toys, action figures, report cards, letters from his girlfriend and parents, then cigarettes, beer bottles, him getting dumped, until finally at the end there's a pistol on the table, and well, you can imagine where it goes next. The short film wasn't genius or anything, but much like my first movie, I was proud of it because I was able to make do with what I had, which wasn't much, and in the spirit of my first movie, I managed not to give up. To this day, whenever someone, for whatever reason, takes a deep dive into my filmography, if you can call it that, they always bring up that short being kind of cool, and I'm proud of it because my odd situation at the time forced me to be really creative. 10 years later, I haven't ever made anything else like that, and The Unexpected Victim is always a reminder to myself that when you're backed into a corner, there's usually a way out. And most importantly, The Unexpected Victim gave me something worthwhile to show the new friends I eventually did make at my new school. And just like happened with the end of the whole mess, they were actually impressed, I think. Which led me to what I consider my first kind of real movie and my last 2 years of high school, chronicled by a little series of 4 movies we and the fans like to call the Quadrant of Dreams saga. This is where it starts to get good. So there I was, new kid, new school, new friends, same camera. It was probably like January or some shitty month like that when I wrote a script for my next and what some might say is the greatest of all time, maybe ever, film epitome. If you think that's a weird and terrible title, you're right. So a brief plot on Epitome. Got a group of high school friends. Leader is a dick, feels like the group was drifting apart, and takes out his frustration by bullying a kid named Strange Richard. His friends love it, the group starts bullying Strange Richard as well, and the whole thing ends in a shootout. You're gonna start seeing some patterns here. Anyhow, history repeated a little bit here. I had my script all ready to go, and I had new friends, and even had a new girlfriend. But of course, I was nervous. So it took a few days, but I eventually worked up the courage to approach some of my buddies and say, hey, you guys wanna, do you wanna like be in this movie that I wrote a script for? I was expecting all sorts of questions and responses. No. What? Movie? What do I have to do? Huh? What do you mean? And things like that. All reasonable questions, by the way. But instead, they all just sort of looked at me. And I remember one of them shrugging and just saying, yeah, sure. And that was it. There was no convincing, cajoling, no persuading. My new friends just agreed to do this thing with me. And yeah, that still really means a lot to me. So me and the gang got down to business. I busted out Sam. We got to filming in the frigid Minnesota spring of 2016. I said before that time is always the biggest issue, and yeah, it was. But the thing is, time also flies when you're having fun, and man, did we have fun. Most of my friends had no acting experience. They'd never done something like this before, and I never really had either. I never really directed something with this many people, a cast of like 8, and I wasn't really sure how to actually film things. Getting people in action to fit in the camera was really hard, and like, I just didn't know how to do it. This is when I learned a very important lesson about videography. How you picture things in your mind is not how they look on camera. Movement and image are illusions, created between cuts and shots. This is why you can picture what a character looks like from head to toe, even if their entire body is never fully in a frame for like the whole film. Parts of them appear from shot to shot, and your brain is able to create a full image later through recollection. This wasn't something I figured out until long after 2016, hence why I can never make things look right on camera. I had no idea how to frame shots, block scenes, shoot movement, or edit coherently. No idea how to do pretty much anything. That's why this film is such a delightful failure of basic filmmaking. Additionally, I had absolute shit for brains when it came to writing, which is why the movie starts with a with a 16-year-old telling his buddy, who was about to kill him, a Shakespeare quote.
Then cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war.
I wrote scripts that took themselves super seriously, tried to be super dark and epic, like Zack Snyder or Christopher Nolan, without having anything near the skill to shoot and edit said scripts in a way that was anything other than, like, heartwarmingly comical at best. So that was the first thing that I learned on Epitome, but not really the last or even most important thing. I like to pretend that I'm a rebel, but really, I'm just an idiot. But as mentioned, my movie was about high schoolers and some good old-fashioned bullying, so naturally, I need to film in a high school. So naturally, I filmed in my high school. The problem was, I was pretty sure they wouldn't just let me and my friends run amok in the school at night for hours on end, so I didn't ask permission. We just did it. And that was awesome. We got our scenes filmed and the movie done, and I started editing it together, getting really excited and proud of what we had accomplished. In a typical stroke of genius for my 16-year-old brain, I took a bunch of screenshots from the movie and posted them on Facebook, with a long description of what the movie was about, when it'd be released, etc., etc. Being that the movie had some bullying and a shooter in it, I posted some screenshots of bullying and shootout stuff, but again, I made it pretty clear that it was for a movie. Well, the next day, me and the whole gang get called down to the principal's office, and there they have some low-res black and white printouts of the pictures from the Facebook post. They made it look like a crime scene, like these are evidence shots from a David Fincher movie, and it turns out that some sweet and very media-savvy people in the community saw those pictures, didn't read the post, and thought they were real. That kids were getting shot and bullied in and around the public high school, or something. And you know how I said my post had the release date on there for the movie? Well, the release date was the same day as our junior prom, because I thought that'd be a great way to celebrate. And I guess for the people who, like, did read the post, that was like a secret clue or a warning that I was going to shoot at prom or something. So they got really mad. I don't know. At that point, things got kind of ugly and weird. The school wasn't too happy with me for filming there without permission, which I get. But during this little chat, I asked the principal if they would have given me permission had I asked. And of course, he said no. So I was like, hell yeah, I made the right move. And you know what? I still stand by that move. Here's why. The police got involved, and there's legal documents they want to sign, and like a ban on the movie ever getting uploaded or publicly released on the internet due to its association with the school, no permission, whatever. Pretty crushing blow, honestly, at the time, and another big setback when I was just starting to get that spark and confidence back. White male teenage filmmakers in rural areas really are the most oppressed group in society, I tell ya. So in the face of this crushing and totalitarian setback, in response to being canceled by the woke deep state mob, I did the only thing a smart and rational 16-year-old boy could do in such a situation. I made another Facebook post. I explained what was going on, roasted the school, and in hindsight probably made a big fool of myself, but I also leaked a completed scene from the movie that didn't involve the school and which had the characters discuss bullying. I really felt like I got him, you know? Well, needless to say, I was back in the office the next day. But I did, in fact, get him, and this is why I don't regret my decision-making process. The school's Streisand affected themselves. Silly fools. My post on Facebook sort of blew up, and by blow up, I mean probably had like 50 likes and a bunch of comments, which was about 1/4 of my high school. Actually, in the credits, I did put the names of everybody who in some way supported me, mostly on Facebook, but I didn't know how to format the credits properly, so that's why the names are cut off on the side. Anyway, suddenly, everyone wanted to see this movie that the deep state was trying to bury. That people would not be denied their cinema. And one of my friends who wanted to see the movie had the idea that if I couldn't post the movie, we should just have a public showing of it somewhere, which wasn't banned by the terms and conditions and ended up being a fantastic idea. So I ordered a projector off Amazon, having to use my buddy's card because I did not have a debit card yet. I found some white sheets. I talked to my buddy's mom because they were in a campground. I made a Facebook event. I invited everyone I could think of. And then, sometime in early June after school ended, I waited for the sun to set on my buddy's campground. I got in front of like 40 or so people from school, and still not really believing this was real life, I thanked them all for their support and for showing up. I thanked my friends for being there with me through this. I laughed, I smiled, and I had one of the best nights of my life. Was Epitome good? Did anyone enjoy it for its cinematic value or story about bullying and group conformity? Hell no! But it was something we all made together. It was something people like drove out to see. It was something that made people laugh and cheer and clap, and it was, I think, something that made people happy. It made a group of teenagers hang out, stand by fires, look up at the Minnesota stars, and enjoy the first few days of summer. It made every cold moment, every second of doubting myself, every minute of not knowing how to make what I saw in my head appear on camera worth it. There are not many moments in life, in this long series of days without enough time, that stand out for me the way that one did. That night with my friends and our movie. But that night, when a kid who less than a year ago had felt like he lost everything and given up on his passion, felt like the center of the universe, and wondered how he had so much to be grateful for. And I do. I did. I had so much to be grateful for. My friends, Sam giving me that lifeline to not just my past, but the future, and to the whole experience. I learned a lot making Epitome. What that experience taught me more than anything was that you just gotta make something happen if you want to make something happen. I'm not advocating for trespassing or disrespecting people's rights or land or property or whatever, but in life and filmmaking, there are times if you aren't willing to just take a risk and follow your gut, you'll never get anything done. A movie is really like a dream, and you have to chase it. It's also like a puzzle, but there are always pieces missing. You have to look for them, and sometimes the wind blows them down the street, and you have to run after them. Sometimes getting it done just takes sheer force of will and nothing else, because the pieces don't fit together the way they're supposed to. So, in other words, just go for it. Grab a camera, find a place, and film. Even if you get kicked out, even if you get in trouble, what you've still had is an experience that no one can take from you. You're going to learn something, and at the end of the day, it's going to be worth it. I want to end the story of Epitome by clarifying that I don't have any beef with my old principal in the school. I'm a grown-up now, and a teacher, and I get it. They were nice to me afterward, and we worked it all out. I think the embargo is lifted. But this experience also taught me that no matter how clear you are about your messaging, your goals, your values, intent, whatever, no matter how painfully obvious you try to make something, it's not going to always matter, because there will always be someone who just doesn't pay attention. Now, you might have noticed that this part is not called Epitome. It's called the Quadrant of Dreams. That's because Epitome is the first in a saga of 4 movies that are connected via the multiverse. More on all that later. First, we need to briefly discuss Film 2 in the saga, a movie that me and the cast of Epitome filmed in the winter of our senior year. The 2016 horror comedy drama flop, No Friend But Fear. Honestly, this one is not good. It's about a group of high school friends, surprise, on their way to a cabin for the weekend when, surprise, they break down in the cold, snowy woods. The main character is a girl named, you're not gonna believe this, Chastity, and there's a villain character named Invidia. And yes, to be clear, that's Chastity, not to be confused with Chastity, even though they mean the same thing, whose boyfriend, whose name is Rudy, is a big jerk, running out of patience because she won't let him bone. The last big plot element is that Chastity's parents make her bring her brother Devin along on the trip, and all the other friends hate Devin. From a technical perspective, most of this movie is actually a pretty big step up from Epitome. I sort of learned how to set up the camera and frame shots by now. There are not as many weird jump cuts or points where you can't tell what's happening. There are some shots and scenes that I still stand by, because this was the first time I ever tried shooting something with like style or with a cohesive visual language. I'm not saying that I totally succeeded, but one of the themes of the movie is this kind of like duality between what is real and what isn't, who's real and who isn't. So I tried to use a lot of mirrors to show 2 things at once, which came out kind of neat at a couple points. The script is fine, it's better than Epitome, and my friends were better actors. The movie honestly holds up okay into the last 10 minutes or so, when characters start fighting and there's like a ghost monster, and the car explodes. And you remember that pesky thing called time? Yeah, there wasn't enough of it on this, but honestly, even if there had been, I probably wouldn't have done any better, because this was all just still way beyond what I was capable of at the time. The problem with this movie is that it's so unbearably, like, functional. But again, functional at a high school amateur level. Unlike Epitome, I really don't think that most of it is laughably bad, and therefore it's a lot less fun to watch. It's not hilarious from start to finish, but neither is it really good either. The result is something which is pretty boring until it goes off the rails at the end and stoops to Epitome, or maybe even below Epitome level incompetency. Worse, the mistakes that are present in the first 3 quarters are not funny, but just weird, such as the movie starting off with 2 back-to-back quotes, and neither of them being very good or even that applicable to the plot, but anyway. The movie itself isn't really what matters. What matters is that the entire cast from Epitome, plus a few new members, came back to be in this movie, and yet for our next couple movies, several cast members dropped out after this one. Why? I'll tell you why. It's because I messed up. There are good and bad days on any project, but this movie was mostly bad days. Specifically, it was one bad day. I was determined that because the movie takes place in one day, we would need to film nearly all of it, the time they're stuck in the car, in one day, so that the weather would look the same. Of course, this is a real problem and concern to have, but I know now that the way to get around that is to film all of the interior stuff one day and all of the exterior stuff another day. But I wasn't smart enough to figure that out then. Or smart enough to, like, look it up on YouTube or something. I don't know. On that note, there's this other thing that you should do called, like, chunking scenes, or there's other names for it, but you basically target specific groups or individuals or locations to get all of their stuff done at once, so that in the real business, you aren't paying people to stand around and do nothing. In the amateur world, you do this because it's courteous, safe, and also just makes more sense and is more efficient. I didn't really know any of that yet either. And in my 17-year-old defense, you can't always do that in these circumstances. But I could have, and I just didn't. What resulted was like 10 people standing around in the snow for hours, or I was sitting in a cold car that just kept getting colder. Now, we did have a warming vehicle on set, which actually appears on camera several times, but this was actually stupid and dangerous of me. It made for some pretty hostile filming conditions, everyone being on edge, and us needing to rush through things. My camera battery also died like instantly, and this was when I learned that batteries, like bodies, really do not like or function well in the cold. The lowest point of the day came about 3/4 of the way through when Emily, who played Chastity, and our friend Lexi, who plays Nvidia, talked about leaving for a work party because we were supposed to have been done at that point and weren't. I don't remember the exact words or exchange leading up to it, but I unfortunately do remember standing in the middle of that cold road and screaming at Lexi to just fucking leave if she was going to. Unsurprisingly, Lexi was one of the cast members not back for the next movie. I'm downright mortified when I think about how I treated my friends that day. I can't even use the excuse of high standards or genius. I was just an unprepared asshole, which is really what most of those genius, high-intensity work environment guides are at the end of the day. I took advantage of my friends. They trusted me to lead them through this thing, and I did, but in the worst way possible. There's just no excuse or justification for what a disaster it was. I had really unfair expectations, little to no real plan, practically no patience. The best I can say is that I bought them all breakfast that morning, and that we got the movie done. That's it. No Friend But Fear is easily the worst experience I've ever had filming something. There are almost no good moments or memories from that day, and I'm sure it was even worse for everyone else. Time is valuable, remember? And there's never really enough of it. And well, yeah, you want to get the movie done. The most important thing is the people, the little moments. If it's not fun, it's really not worth it for me, because the point isn't really the movie. It's stupid, but honestly, the real movie is the friends we made along the way. None of my friends or anyone who's in my movies remembers their characters, or the plot, or the themes, or whatever. I mean, yeah, I wish they would, but what they do remember, and what's honestly more important, is the silly moments in between writing and release. They aren't getting paid, they're there because they trust you. They're there because they want to be there, because they all want to share and be a part of something. So what I learned from No Friend But Fear is that people, your friends, are the most important and valuable resource you have. Whatever they ask, or whatever you can do to take care of them, you do. And that's it. If you don't treat people right, nothing that comes out of the camera is going to be worth it. It's not always easy, and I'm not saying that I got better immediately after this movie or that I don't still fuck up, but people will notice that you tried. And on that movie, I didn't even really try. After No Friend But Fear, though, and all of its cold misery, my friends and I pretty much got right back to work on our next movie, which dropped 5 or so months later in May of 2017, right around the time that we graduated. There's honestly not a lot to say about this one. What's most notable about A Beautiful Tragedy is that it was my first feature-length movie at an hour and a half. It really didn't need to be that long, and while it was my best movie at the time from a technical standpoint, it's one of the hardest to watch. I remember discussing with one of my buddies at Perkins late one night on a summer 2017 evening. Take me back. And he pretty much summed up the biggest problems with this by saying that every scene is just like the same conversation repeated over and over again. And he's totally right. A Beautiful Tragedy was certainly my most ambitious movie at the time, but it was actually doable based on what we were capable of. The biggest miss is the fight scene at the end of the film, which, like my earlier movies, came out pretty comical when it's supposed to be epic. The movie is a time travel story about a man who like gets to go back in time and revisit his high school days to fix past mistakes or whatever, but he realizes that he causes all the mistakes, of course. And the story also set the stage for my next film, which was a sequel to this one called Never Look Up. More on that later. I only even bring up A Beautiful Tragedy here because it's one of the movies that has a purely technical lesson and not a long, rambling, emotional lesson attached. This is a 90-minute movie which has no less than 16 radio songs in it, which is approximately one song every 6 minutes. And remember, about 3 out of those 6 minutes are dedicated to each song. And that's not even accounting for instrumentals, all of which are either random stock instrumentals from YouTube or instrumental versions of other radio songs. Some version of What Is Love appears twice in the film, and there are 2 Lana Del Rey songs, 2 Rain songs, Sign of the Times appears in 2 different versions and scenes, and then pretty much every other popular radio song from 2017 makes an appearance somewhere in the movie. There's a reason for all this, and it's not intentional. To work faster, I edited the movie as we filmed, and it wasn't a very long shooting schedule, like maybe a month or so, at most. On top of that, my friends and I were working and graduating. My point is that we kind of just flew through this with a lot of other things going on, and there's another reason for that, which I'll get to in a minute. But editing as you film isn't necessarily bad, however, you have to, put enough time into the edit, which I didn't. Editing as I filmed also meant that big chunks of the movie were done at different times and missing for weeks on end. So I edited each scene on its own, like in its own file, almost as if it were its own film, without really thinking about the narrative as a whole. Ergo, each scene got, edited like its own film. And as far as my style went as a 17-year-old filmmaker, nothing to me said absolute cinema in style like a long, moody opening credit sequence set to Lana Del Rey and an abstract ending set to some other 2016 dark indie pop song, preferably also by Lana Del Rey, though by 2017 I was also firmly in my Halsey era, and honestly still am. So that's exactly how most scenes in the movie began, with some sort of short opening credits style equivalent, with characters or landscapes looking sad and set to some sort of overly dramatic music that didn't really blend with the rest of the scene when it actually began. Then, about 2 minutes later, when the scene started to wind down, we of course had to throw another 2017 banger in there, meaning that, yep, you guessed it, we would be transitioning from one scene to another, with 2 very different songs awkwardly smashed next to each other, usually with a healthy 7 or so seconds of black screen in the middle to sort of help things breathe, or give the audience a chance to just inject some heroin without missing any of the action. Of course, none of this was a problem until I put the whole thing together and realized what an unwieldy and tonally inconsistent mess it was. Not only was it almost twice as long as I thought it was going to be, but the scenes had little to no blend or connection, which meant the pacing was atrocious, and I never felt like you were getting anywhere. And just to highlight how stupid I was, keep in mind that this was 2017, a year after Suicide Squad had come out, something I had seen like 3 times and been clowning on for a year. I had also made 2 movies before this that didn't have the same problem to the same effect, so I knew how to avoid this. But to really emphasize how stupid and cocky I was, I remember putting it all together, realizing how fucked it all was, and my first thought being of that one George Lucas clip when he and Rick McCallum react to the assembly cut of The Phantom Menace. You know the clip. Actually, this Red Letter Media breakdown is pretty accurate.
After the rough cut screening of the movie for the first time, everyone in attendance looks just as baffled at the clusterfuck as we were. George admits to throwing too much out there.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Yeah. The editor then attempts to explain pacing and why 4 scenes with totally different emotional tones don't work well together. Rick McCallum is frozen in utter shock at how horrible the movie was. Lucas then realizes that he can't remove major segments of the movie in editing because they're intertwined.
I mean, I've thought about this quite a bit, and the tricky part is you almost can't take any of those pieces out of there now. Because each one kind of takes you to the next place, and you can't jump. No, I love it.
Hey, it's too late now. Later on, after everybody started drinking, Lucas attempts to explain his newly minted bowel movement as bold and extreme, stylistic.
It's stylistically designed to be that way, and you can't undo that, but we can diminish the effects of it.
No one looks like they know what's going on, and they all look like they're about to start pointing fingers.
So yeah, I knew I messed up, but I was like, so did George Lucas. So it's cool. That in mind, did I make any effort to save my masterpiece? Did I take the few hours at most necessary to remove some songs and weave the whole cut into something viable? Did I go back to the drawing board and reevaluate my tonal inconsistencies and awkward to non-existing transitions? Of course not! You see, like George Lucas, I decided that my movie was stylistically designed to be that way. In fact, I remember defending this cut.
I can't shoot them anymore.
By saying something like, well, you know, the other characters are ignoring Harold's feelings, so it makes sense that his breakup song is immediately overshadowed by the edgy pop song that plays over all the other characters moving on without him. Checkmate, liberal. And I mean, yeah, okay, whatever. Maybe if that were like the only time in the movie this happened, that would be valid. But it's not. It actually happens again in this exact scene.
What is love? Gucci. What is love?
So, yeah. But also, I had no patience. I was rushing. Yeah, I was busy graduating high school and working at the movie theater and all that, but also, I still hadn't developed any patience as a filmmaker, which is something you absolutely need. I was ready to be done and excited to show everyone what we had made, because, despite its flaws, I was still proud of it. I had made a full-length movie after all, and in terms of actual style or competent cinematography, this was the closest I had ever come. This was the first time I actually, filmed multiple takes of something from different angles so it cut together more smoothly. I also built this weird little cardboard contraption to go around Sam's mic, which was supposed to block the wind and funnel voices into the mic. I called it Leroy, I don't know why, and Leroy actually kind of worked. I had my biggest cast ever, so big in fact that I not only revised the script to fit some more actors into it, but I actually had to turn a few people away with the promise that there would be room for them in my next movie, which was already in production at the time. This was a huge change from feeling like I had to beg just a few of my closest friends to please be in just one movie. So there was all that, which is maybe wholesome and understandable, but I was also just chomping at the bit to get on to my next movie, which, for a long time, was my true magnum opus. But before we get to that, I just want to reiterate that the main lesson of A Beautiful Tragedy is to listen to other people's advice. And if you know something is wrong, fix it. Don't rush through things. Take your time. Let things breathe. Don't wholly rely on music, because when you have so many songs crammed into something, not a single one is going to stand out. And that sucks because, like I said, some things in the movie do work. For example, the older I get, the more this scene, when the main character goes back in time for the first time, makes me smile. It's actually a good use of music because I chose a song that was really popular in 2017. So every time I watch this, it's like, boom, I'm back in May of 2017 because that's what you'd be hearing. It reminds me of my friends and graduating and being so excited for the future and beginning our lives, making our next movie, everything. It gets me kind of emotional. The problem is that all of this goodwill vanishes by the time you're beaten over the head with the 10th 2017 pop song in as many minutes, and every scene is just characters in some new, albeit pretty, part of my rural town talking about how sad they are to be growing up and how much it sucks that their friend group is coming apart at the seams. Or, as my middle school band teacher told me and the rest of the trumpet section once, when everything is special, nothing is special. So, chill the hell out, you young filmmakers. Show some restraint. You only get one Lana Del Rey song per 90 minutes. Anything more than that is just too much. And speaking of too much, here's the real reason A Beautiful Tragedy was a flop. Between No Friend But Fear and A Beautiful Tragedy, I got this idea that the time travel in A Beautiful Tragedy would create a multiverse, and that the sequel to A Beautiful Tragedy would be an epic, R-rated finale full of blood, which would pull together Epitome, No Friend But Fear, and A Beautiful Tragedy into an epic multiversal climax, which would see the return of beloved heroes and reviled villains. I started working on a script, which would eventually turn into a movie called Never Look Up, while we were getting ready to film A Beautiful Tragedy. That meant I was also casting that movie while we shot A Beautiful Tragedy, and I was honestly way more excited to film the sequel than what I was actually working on at the time. I changed a few things in A Beautiful Tragedy to fit Never Look Up more, and honestly, A Beautiful Tragedy just felt like a speed bump on the way to Never Look Up. I fell victim to one of the oldest tricks in the book, and my movie really suffered because of it. But I was just so excited. So maybe like a week or two after completing A Beautiful Tragedy, just enough time to graduate high school, me and the gang got to work on the epic finale, Never Look Up. Before I get to this whole thing, though, let me update you a little on our cast of characters that we have at this point. Never Look Up was my biggest cast ever at the time, with 19 characters. The entire cast of Epitome was back for this one, with the exception of 2, one of those being Lexi, the girl I yelled at, who hadn't been in A Beautiful Tragedy either. The other guy who didn't come back was my buddy Tristan, who had been in all 3 previous films, and he played the lead in 2 of them. So we have most of the original gang, the 4 new actors who debuted in A Beautiful Tragedy, and the 2 new actors who debuted in No Friend But Fear, plus a whole group of new people. Again, almost more than I needed, but it was absolutely a good problem to have. So, that's the cast. Here's the plot. After the mention of time travel in A Beautiful Tragedy, a multiverse was created. Some people who live through really traumatic events and are born with some kind of telekinetic ability are able to see other universes as part of their trauma. Because of this, many of them end up going insane. To mitigate that, James Wells, the inventor of time travel from the last movie, creates a group called the Dreamers and gives them this nice little farm to live on and kind of work through their trauma together. The Dreamers are people who can see the multiple realities, and they recruit new Dreamers to give them the necessary skills to work through this new power. Some Dreamers can also travel to these other realities. That's a lot. I know. So anyway, a few characters from each of my past 3 films are all Dreamers, and they start remembering their lives from other universes, specifically their characters in other films. Chastity is more or less the main character here, and she gets recruited by this guy named Daniel, who's like the most alpha male dreamer there is. But the problem with Daniel, though, is that he's actually leaving the Dreamers because he's not content with just coping. Daniel's pretty much the movie's villain, and his goal is to travel through the multiverse in search of a timeline where his life doesn't end in tragedy. Chastity doesn't know he's a bad guy, though, and thinks he's kind of into her until the climax of the film when Daniel, Chastity, and Brian hop through the multiverse and end up in the timelines of the previous movies. This is when Chastity finds out that Daniel was just using her to resurrect his dead girlfriend, and Chastity, instead of being able to save her dead brother, actually brings back her evil ex-boyfriend Rudy from No Friend But Fear, who was in league with Daniel because Daniel and Rudy have a mutual friend named Gunnar who was mentioned in No Friend But Fear. The other big twist is that Daniel also hatched a plan with Harold, Brian's buddy, in A Beautiful Tragedy, and they're all coming back to the main timeline to get revenge. So they do. The bad guys from the multiverse, led by Daniel and called, you're not going to believe this, the Awakened, pull back up to the main timeline, kill most of the Dreamers, and then get ready to live their lives. But wait, there's another twist. Gunnar and Daniel's dead girlfriend, Victoria, actually had a little something going on, and are just using Daniel to resurrect themselves. So Gunnar kills Daniel, takes charge, and now things are looking even worse for the heroes. But just when the villains are about to escape, Brian and Harold pull up, and instead of wanting revenge, Harold has been convinced by Brian to be a good guy. Along with them comes James Wells himself, head of the Dreamers, and together with Chastity and one remaining Dreamer, they manage to take out the villains and send them back to their timelines. Then, after that, we learn from a psychic fight between Chastity and Victoria that Victoria was actually pregnant when she died. But we also learn at the end of the scene that she was actually not pregnant with Daniel's baby, but was actually pregnant with Gunnar's baby. And after this, we learn from James Wells that James Wells is actually Daniel's father. Then we have a heartfelt goodbye with Harold. The heroes revel in these twists and their melancholic victory. When we have an epilogue set at the farm where Chastity and Brian reflect on the themes of the movie, just in case you missed them, that the past can't be changed. They look at some graves, stare out at a field, and then the audience gets a beautiful montage of the past 4 movies set to an Imagine Dragons song, and we fade to black. Wow. Now at this point, you may be wondering, did we really need such a detailed play-by-play of the entire plot? Was that essential? And to that I say, you fool. That wasn't even close to a full play-by-play. There's so much more. And also, yes, it was necessary, because the convoluted and insane plot is the big lesson that I learned from this movie. In terms of the actual filming, I mean, you know what to expect at this point. Most of it is okay, on par with the last one. You can see what it looks like in these clips. There are moments I like and moments which are just painfully unwatchable. The real problem here, maybe for the first time, is actually the script itself. I think that the past 3 have flaws, yeah, but it's ultimately the awful filming which butchers any merit the scripts might have had. In Never Look Up, I wrote a script that was over 100 pages long and just had way too much shit going on. There was no way I could have ever effectively balanced everything I wanted this movie to do and be, but I tried anyway, and it was a mess. A mess, I tell you. There's like 15 principal characters, and even though I tried to minimize or recap what was important from past films, it's hard to keep track of everything and remember the ins and outs, especially for people who had maybe seen each of the other 3 movies once, or had maybe seen some of them, or maybe even none of them. On top of that, there are sincerely like 7 different twists or reveals dropped on the audience in the last 15 or so minutes of the movie, which is just, well, obviously it's way too much. 1 or 2 would have been enough and stood out way more. Again, if everything's special, nothing is special. But what's really annoying about this is that I had already done a twist ending in A Beautiful Tragedy, and I actually think that it worked pretty well, so I knew how to do it. But in this movie, I just decided I finally deserved my epic, and I wanted to make something that felt like a real culmination of everything we'd done up to that point. So it had to be long. Almost every character had to die. Every character needed an arc. I needed a new, all-powerful villain. I needed lore, and I needed to pay homage to 3 other movies. Some of that worked, and most of it, well, didn't. For positives, I'll say this. This is my first movie that has any kind of real visual coherence throughout, or a clear visual theme, even more so than No Friend But Fear. Most of the actors wore clothes that fit a specific color scheme, there's a lot of blue natural light, some great uses of the golden hour. This was the first time I ever did any kind of color grading, and even though it's pretty minimal, and I would do it much differently now, it made a huge difference. I played around with the new aspect ratio to make it feel, you know, more epic or whatever, and I learned from my needle drop mistakes on the last movie. Music in this works much better than it did in A Beautiful Tragedy, or even the first 2 films in the saga. Specifically, I didn't have to rely so much on just radio songs because I had my buddy Kyle actually write a score for this movie, and this is my first movie that had an original score. It obviously made a huge difference. I've collaborated with Kyle like 4 or 5 times since, and honestly, if you have a friend who makes music or you can pay someone, just do it. It is so worth it. To me, music has to be the second or third most important part of a film, and having a guy who can make adjustments or just make something unique to your film brings it up like 10 levels. As for the radio songs that are in the film, these are better too. For example, in Epitome, I used the song Don't Let Me Down by the Chainsmokers during one of the friend group scenes because it was just a hit banger at the time. Then, in Never Look Up, William, a character from Epitome, isn't into Daniel's whole evil plan, and he takes his own life. During that scene, I used a sad acoustic version of Don't Let Me Down from a State Farm commercial, which is kind of weird, but I did the same thing at the end of the movie, when the villains are winning and things are looking bad for a hero Chastity. In No From a Fear, there's a fan favorite, emotional, and iconic sequence when the hit song Guys My Age by Hey Violet plays during a Rudy scene. And when Rudy's back to defeat Chastity in No From a Fear, you guessed it, a stripped version of the same song. Again, is this genius? Is it innovative? Is it groundbreaking? Of course not. Is it a little on the nose? Is it borderline cheesy? Of course it is. But the reason I bring it up is because it was the most intentional I had been with my music choices up to that point. I mean, I always tried to pay attention to lyrics and such, but a lot of those songs could have been swapped for anything that sounded similar, and it would have been fine. But with these 2, I was really thinking about how each character felt specifically and how their stories were going to end. And being that this movie was my first sequel, and was also 2 hours long, I think this was the most I ever understood some of my characters, and some of them are actually pretty well developed by the end of it all. That's something I'm proud of. The credits music for this one, yes, the Imagine Dragons, is also a choice I absolutely stand by. That song dropped when we were in the middle of filming, and I just knew, like instantly, that I needed to use it. The lyrics fit the theme of my story perfectly, and I could just see that beautiful montage in my head right away. In a lot of ways, Never Look Up was the highlight of my fake filmmaking career up to that point. It showed off almost everything I had learned. It had my friends' best acting. It was long, and most importantly, this was my first movie that ever played in a theater. Yeah, that campground showing of Epitome from a year ago, small potatoes. Never Look Up was absolute cinema, baby, and we are going to prove it by playing it in a cinema. Before you get too impressed, remember that I worked at a movie theater at the time, so I had an in. It also only played for 1 showing, and I had to pay for it, so like it wasn't a real theatrical run or anything. But still, I was 17, just turning 18, and you know what? Hell yeah. And you know what? People showed up too. Not just people from school, but their families, and adults, and grandmas, and friends of family, and all sorts of random people from the woodwork who came to check out what we've been up to. There aren't really any good words to express how incredible that was. And there also aren't really any good words to explain what an incredible failure it was. Like I said, Never Look Up is a confusing mess. This was also a good 4 to 5 years before multiverse movies hit the mainstream, so like, most people from my town who came to see this movie had no clue what a multiverse was, and I did not do a very good job of explaining it. Remember, Never Look Up is also pretty dependent on the last 3 movies in the Quadrant of Dream Saga, and a lot of people hadn't seen those. So now you have a movie that's very long, very confusing, very amateur, and honestly, pretty boring and hard to watch as a result of those things. And, yeah, unsurprisingly, no one really liked it. In addition, the last 30 or so minutes, which, other than the onslaught of twists and reveals, are probably the best part of the movie, are a lot. Because we were in high school and we made our other movies, and I knew parents and grandmas and stuff would be watching them, I tried to keep the movies more or less appropriate, like PG-13 and all that, but Never Look Up was cinema, remember? And it was going to be epic, and it was going to be dark, and it was going to be mature. So that meant swearing and stuff. On the third act, when the villains are winning, the gloves kind of came off. I mean, like, not really. That would happen in later movies, but enough that the movie is technically rated R. One of my friends, Ben, who had been around since Epitome, was always really wanting to say fuck, and I always told him no. Well, wanting to please my friends, I gave them all something to do in this script that I knew they'd been wanting for a while. For Ben, that was saying fuck in the third act, which he did. And it's not like in a joke. He says it in response to Rudy suggesting that Hank take part in sexually assaulting Chastity. Then, while protesting this suggestion, Hank is violently, if goofily, gunned down by the villains, and when Chastity mourns them, Rudy tells her to,
Adam. Oh no.
Oh, shut the fuck up.
At another point, the gunner character calls her
Our sugar tits.
Rudy smacks her across the face, and the entire climax in general is scattered with various innuendos, most of which come from the villains and are, again, bordering or based on sexual assault or harassment. In other words, not exactly crowd-pleasing material, especially for people's grandmas and stuff. I bring this all up because another big lesson I learned from this movie was to know your audience. Know what's too much. A lot of this was too much. And yeah, it's supposed to be too much, and you shouldn't let expectations from other people limit you, but if that's the case, then you have to be ready not to care what the audience thinks, and I cared what the audience thought. So now, when I look back at some of these sequences, I cringe so hard I feel myself break the sound barrier. Additionally, a lot of this stands in contrast to some sequences which just don't work and are stupid, such as the execution sequence, which is supposed to be epic, and then followed up by, you guessed it, a Lana Del Rey song. Which, while fitting the story and vibe, at least I think, was not really the vibe I think most of my audience was expecting. The result was a bunch of weird sequences that take themselves extremely seriously, and clearly want the audience to take them seriously as well, but which are just uncomfortable and goofy. I just got too damn big for my britches here. Too cocky, too ambitious, too focused on the wrong things. At the time, though, I wasn't aware of any of this. I was pretty convinced we had delivered absolute cinema, and that everyone else would think so too. It wasn't until a few years later, when we played a few more movies in theaters, and none of the attendants ever topped Never Look Up, that I realized I had pretty much blown my shot. People gave me a chance, and I absolutely fumbled. And so, with Never Look Up and the conclusion of the Quadrant of Dream Saga, I next entered, partly on purpose, but mostly, you know, on accident, the flop era. So to be clear, me and the gang came off Never Look Up feeling pretty good about things. I was confident we dropped a banger and we were ready for long-term success. So from that success, I decided to do something which actually was smart, scale things way back and apply everything we'd learned on a big project to a small project. So I banged out a short script with 4 principal characters and set mostly in one location. I was actually enrolled in some videography courses at the time at my local college, and at this point, I got to borrow some equipment too. Good old trusty Sam was only used for one shot in this movie, and the rest was with a real video camera, the Sony XD cam from school. My buddy had a great secluded cabin on a lake. It was the middle of cold, crisp autumn. I had another 10 out of 10 banger masterpiece of a script with 0 flaws, a brand new fog machine, and 4 dedicated friends, all returning actors, ready to go crazy. And then, of course, I messed it up. The movie I made was called Sudafed. Yes, like the drug. And honestly, I really liked a lot about this one, except for the ending. Just like with No Friend But Fear, we ran out of time and had to rush the conclusion, but most of the stuff leading up to that is solid enough. This was my first time really doing any sort of planning and having specific things I wanted to focus on. The smaller cast and single location was a lot of fun, and let us show off what we'd all learned from previous movies. Sudafed led to a model that I followed a few times over the next few years with a big ambitious movie where I learned a lot, followed by a very small project where I then showed off those skills. Other than that though, there's really not a lot to say about this one. I think it's one of our better movies despite quite a few flaws, but practically nobody saw it. We were in college by this point, so it wasn't like a school thing, and we didn't have a big theater group showing for it, so it just sort of got dumped online and forgotten about, which sucks. I will add this caveat though. We showed it to a group of some of our close friends from high school, and afterwards one girl said something like, "I could never imagine doing something like that. It's so embarrassing." And obviously that hurt, coming from someone who I thought was my friend. But because I'm a toxic and judgmental fuck, I stopped being sad about it pretty quickly and got mad about it instead. Because the person who said this was constantly getting hammered and posting videos of drunken escapades that weren't really funny or amusing, and she was also like a teenager, just like me, and that was behavior that I found embarrassing. I bring this up because I think a lot of us, especially when we're first starting out or even when we're adults and it's not just kids being cute anymore, can feel embarrassed or nervous about filmmaking and worry that people are going to find it cringe or embarrassing or make fun of us or playing dress up or make believe or whatever. And honestly, there's always going to be someone like that. I'm not going to lie to you. They might even be your friend. But everyone, especially teenagers, does something at some point, maybe even multiple times, that's cringe or embarrassing. It made me feel better to know that what I was doing was something that I really cared about and something that not just anyone could do. It was something that gave me memories with my friends I'll always remember, and gave us something we'll always have. Is it as funny or as easy as stealing street signs or face planting on the concrete or throwing up all over yourself and then posting it? No, but it was genuine, it was hard, and above all, it was ours. It was me. So if anyone ever tries to embarrass you or make you second guess your passion, just tell them to fuck off. I mean, be receptive to criticism and feedback, but be self-aware. Don't let a shallow and mean-spirited person try to make you feel small about the things that you love.
Sorry I spooked you, Terry.
Now, after Sudafed, I wrote a bigger script that would have added some new cast members and brought back a lot of the cast from Never Look Up. The Sudafed cast even helped me write it, and I was pretty excited to get things rolling that summer. Production on this next film even got far enough along that we all started rehearsing, but then, life happened. Me and my girlfriend at the time, who had been in every one of my movies since Epitome, broke up. And with people being far apart because of college and things now, and also just my motivation not quite being there, we didn't make this new movie happen. I met some new people at my college and spent a lot more time with them than I had previously. Don't get me wrong, I still saw, talked to, and hung out with my high school friends, but, things just get harder after high school. Things change. A lot of other things went on in my life that summer, and movie making just kind of took a back seat. We'd made 3 movies in 2017, still a record for me, and 8 months into 2018, I had nothing. But at the end of that summer, I did a little soul searching and I came up with something. Probably my first really personal script that I'd written at that point. My headspace was pretty close to what it had been in the summer of 2015 when I'd failed to finish The Blissfully Scorned, but I was older now, and I'd learned a lot since then, and I knew how to put those feelings more into writing. The result was a script called Choices, and in hindsight, this is an admittedly bad script. Like Sudafed, there are only 4 characters and minimal locations, which was smart, but in a lot of ways, it was like starting from scratch. Choices was personal in the sense that most of it was 2 guys driving the story with dialogue and discussing the morals and merits of important life decisions, especially when it comes to friends and girlfriends. It was very clunky and trying to be smarter than it was, and came out pretty boring despite being one of my shortest movies at around 45 minutes. It also had an entirely new cast of friends that I made at college, including my then new and still current girlfriend, Abby. Hi, Abby. None of my new actors had any acting experience, but they all just jumped right in. There is one scene in this movie I like quite a bit, though. At the end, the villain murders his girlfriend, and again, there are mistakes, but this was the best fight scene I'd ever done. We had a lot of time to practice it, we ran through it a bunch of times, and we actually used some props, like a watermelon as Abby's head, and some little rocks for teeth that had been knocked out. We got pretty liberal with the fake blood, and I'm still pretty proud of how some of these shots look. The big mistake I made, though, was in breaking the 180-degree rule, which, if you aren't aware, is a guideline for making sure action and placement remain consistent and make sense. There's an imaginary line that you cannot cross, meaning that in real-life space, You have 180 degrees to use freely rather than all 360 degrees. If a character is shown on the right side of the screen, they need to stay on the right side of the screen through the entire scene. Here you can see that I cross the imaginary line and my actors change position. It makes the scene disorienting and takes you out of the action. I probably did this on my earlier movies at some point too, but those were so cobbled together it didn't even matter. In this scene though, it really stands out because the backgrounds look the same and it seems like the actors are teleporting. Choices also saw the drop of our new camera, a gift for my dad and grandma. Again, God bless them. I called this bad boy Old Red because it was a Red Canon Rebel DSLR. In this movie, I got to play with manual focus for the first time, leading to this opening shot, which I still like. But despite all of that and a pretty solid climax, Choices, like Sudafed, was a flop. Nobody watched this movie either. It got shoved online with no big showing. The best it got was another group showing with our close friends, and though this was small, it ended up being important. Choices was the launching pad for my next two movies, which had casts over double the size and introduced some new fan favorites. Somehow, Choices convinced some of my other friends from college to join the fun, and that winter, we made our second film of 2018, No Parents. No Parents is set, you guessed it, mostly in one location, and is about a group of teens having a house party. No Parents is me at my most morally pretentious and condescending, which is probably why no one likes this movie except for me, but pretty much the party goes wrong, with someone dying of alcohol poisoning, the villain date raping his girlfriend, the reveal of an unwanted pregnancy, and of course, a stoner character taking acid in the basement while he listens to Pink Floyd, and hallucinating an owl monster that's a confusing symbol for morality whose shape the stoner eventually takes on, leading him to rampage through the house with a butcher knife, killing all the characters who have engaged in evil or immoral behavior. There's too much monologuing and too much swearing, but whatever. No one else agrees with me, but No Parents is some of my favorite acting from a cast that was pretty new. I really like some of these characters, I like the villain, and the fog machine, bought for Sudafed of course, use is unparalleled. Because we were big kids in college now, there were also no restrictions on swearing or content or anything like that. So like most of the people I knew from videography classes and stuff were doing shorts, or action, or comedy or something, and I was just never really into that type of thing. I kind of thought that there was a not-so-nice side to the things a lot of my friends were up to in college, and that's how we ended up with a pretty nasty script that tried to tackle some complicated problems. I don't think this was handled in the most tasteful way at all times, but I learned from Never Look Up was how to at least try, and also how to know and respect your audience, remember? Well, at this point, I had no audience, so I could just sort of do whatever I wanted, but I tried to do it more right than I had in the past. One of the big lessons that I had learned and applied well here besides all of that was pairing up actors based off either chemistry or the relationships they already had in real life. I think each actor in this movie really nailed their character, and the relationships come through on screen much better than they had in the past. With all of that said, again, nobody saw this movie. It got dumped online and we watched it as a cast. That was it. But I felt pretty good about it at the time. We used some real lighting equipment for the first time ever, and going into 2019 with a solid cast and a little more money than I had in the past, it's time to go big again, which leads us out of the flop era and into Roses of the West is consistently one of my favorite things I've ever made. It's a Western that we filmed in the summer of 2019. It did get a theatrical release, a decent amount of people actually saw it, and it brought back some classic actors from the Quadrant of Dreams saga, which was just, well, it felt good. It felt like coming home. The plot of this one is that some years after the American Civil War, two buddies from the North named Thomas and Henry are attending college in Texas. Thomas begins seeing a woman named Elizabeth, whose older brother James is an angry and bitter ex-Confederate soldier who really doesn't like Yankees and really doesn't like Thomas. But he does love Elizabeth, or at least thinks and pretends that he does. Eventually, Elizabeth convinces James to go on a hunting trip with Thomas to get to know him better. The two go, they get into an argument, and shoot each other out in the desert. Neither one dies, and they spend the rest of the movie wounded and arguing with each other about various topics, stuck under the blazing Texas, sun. Meanwhile, Jed McMurtry, town bad guy and former war buddy of James, is busy causing trouble and trying to get Elizabeth to marry him. He ends up kidnapping Elizabeth, but one of his henchmen, Robert, feels a little bad about all the kidnapping and murdering and finds James and Thomas in the desert. By the time he gets to them, they've had a lot of time to talk, and you think that maybe James has let go of all the racism and bitterness and is an alright guy. But no. As soon as Robert helps him on his feet, James kills Thomas, revealing that he has learned nothing, and though he goes with Robert to confront Jed and free Elizabeth, Elizabeth and James's on-again, off-again 1800s situationship abandon him for what he did to Thomas, so he walks off alone into the woods and the movie ends. I was kind of going for a revisionist Western take here, trying to articulate a rebuttal against lost cause mythology and focus on the importance of individual, generational, and systemic change as necessary for healing and progress. Does all of that come through? I mean, I don't know. It does for me, but I also wrote the script, you know? What I like most about the plot, though, is the twist that James, our rugged gunslinger, doesn't change. The rugged heart of gold under the layers of dirty cowboy is a common trope, and I quite like the twist that he stays a piece of shit and loses everything. The script was easily my most complicated, second maybe to Never Look Up, but I think I learned a lot from that because this was much more streamlined, with the conflict straightforward and every event tied to the same conflict. Anyway, no one gives a shit about the story, so next topic. Cool technical things. We built a set. A saloon, specifically, and to be clear, I mostly just got lucky. My buddy lived on a farm and his dad had a garage that we, totally cleaned out. Then we built a bar on the inside, made some batwing doors, laid down some planks of wood, hung up some old paintings, and voila! Very low budget saloon. If you want to be a filmmaker, my advice is to have a junk collector on speed dial. They will come through every time and save you. Next cool thing. This was my first time shooting with a multicam setup, and it was so worth it. If your actors know their lines, which thanks to several rehearsals, mine more or less did, it can save a lot of time and create a much more authentic scene. There's obviously a lot more footage to cut between, and things just get a lot smoother. Some notes on this. First, why did I go from a 1-camera setup to sometimes a 3-camera setup? Well, because I learned from shooting big groups and Never Look Up that it's really hard, and moving gear around between shots takes forever. Second, this gave me more options for audio. And third, I felt like you get a lot more creative, and again, scenes just flow better when you can run them from top to bottom instead of stopping every other shot. But if you're a new filmmaker, especially one with maybe just a cell phone or one digital camera, you may be wondering, how do you do this? It's really not that complicated, honestly. The first step is to decide whether we even need a multicam setup, because not every scene does. This scene, for example, is all one camera, because there are only 2 characters and they're on screen together for quite a few takes. The camera also bounces around the riverside a lot, the lighting's all natural, and there's no crew or props on the set that needed to get moved. Anything handheld is also going to benefit from one camera. Take this scene on the porch, though. There are 6 or so characters that pop in and out of the scene, all of whom speak at some point, and few of which who really move around. It's a long scene, too, with a lot of dialogue and a very fixed 180-degree line. There are also a lot of extras on set helping out, a lot of gear lying around, and other things in the background that I didn't want shown, so the more stationary, locked setup of multiple cameras really benefited these scenes. So at this point, your second step is to set up the cameras. For this scene, I have a camera on the character who speaks the most, Elizabeth. I have another camera on a few of the characters who just have a couple lines, and they're sharing the mic. Lastly, there's a third camera set up in the center, capturing the entire group, so there's always something to cut back to hide errors, shake things up a little, reaffirm placement, etc. Now, is this the best setup? Is this the only setup? Do you have to do it this way? No. If you have more time, or less cameras, or a different preference, you could run this scene 3 or 4 times. First, you can shoot the whole thing wide. Then, you can put your camera on the lead and run it again. Then, put it on the side characters and run a third time, with some small pickups here and there. That works too. But if you want to run it all at once, just once or twice, you're going to need multiple cameras. For anyone really plugged into things, you may have read some recent negativity about multicam setups post-Gladiator 2. According to Ridley Scott's cinematographer, Scott exclusively filmed that movie with multicam setups because then he could just pick and choose whatever he wanted in post instead of having to think about it on set. This led to equipment appearing in shots that had to be digitally removed and severely limited how they could block, frame, and light scenes on set. This led the cinematographer, John Matheson, to refer to Scott in his current style as lazy, a sentiment I saw a lot of cinematographers echo. And honestly, is Matheson right? Kind of. Scott has gotten lazy, I think, but I don't see anyone making their own films for $20 and a sandwich having the same problems as Ridley Scott. If you have the equipment and the bodies, I say give it a shot. Like anything else, one camera, shaky cam, gimbal, drone, tripod, monopod, whatever, it's a tool, a strategy, and there will be times when it works and times when it doesn't. Your job as a director is to decide when it works for you and when it doesn't. There's nothing else to it. Beyond all of that, or maybe because of all of that, Roses was, I feel, the most organized I've ever been as a director. I had a great group of people behind me helping things run smoothly. Someone to supervise the script, people to move equipment, people to do makeup and oversee costumes. My schedule is also pretty good too. For each major location, such as the saloon, the porch, or the bad guy lair, I blocked out entire days, months ahead of time, that would be dedicated to just those locations. Obviously, this is how big productions do it, but it's a lot easier said than done when you're a college student. And what I found is that basically, for every scene, anticipate about an hour of shooting, regardless of length. The longer ones will average out the shorter ones. That's kind of my rule anyway. I also bought a bunch of hot dogs, frozen hamburgers, and we grilled them all up for everyone. And this is really important for a number of reasons. Remember earlier when I talked about not taking care of my cast and the on-set experience being miserable, like with No Friend But Fear? Yeah, I learned from that. And having people fed with access to food and water made a huge difference in morale, which is essential when there's like 20 people spending 2 whole days in the same place filming. Taking a break to sit and talk with people also makes it a lot more fun because, well, it should be fun before anything else. And hopefully the people you're with are your friends. And really, there's nothing like sitting around with your best friends, watching the sunset over your saloon while everyone's dressed like cowboys. Most of the West was also their first time filming with animals. I had a buddy that ran a horse ranch, and he was kind enough to let us borrow some steeds. I wasn't positive he'd say yes, so I wrote the script assuming they wouldn't be there, but he did say yes, and we got our horses. Again, it never hurts to ask, but always have a plan B. The biggest challenge with Roses, surprisingly, was the editing. Because I had so many great people around me, shooting it was a fun challenge, but no sweat. Editing it, however, was up to just me, and I was a terrible editor. I mean this at every level. First, the movie was too long. My assembly cut was 3.5 hours. That's insane for an amateur film. This cut was an eternal snooze fest. It never felt like it was going anywhere and had no momentum, just like Never Look Up. But having learned from Never Look Up, I knew how to chop it down. So for the theater, I was able to come up with a 2.5 hour version that, while losing some content I really liked, got the movie to a much more steady pace and really focused on the things I knew people would like to see: horses, costumes, and gunfights. Some years later, I recut the whole thing to a middle-of-the-road 3 hours that I'm pretty happy with, but I think the 2.5 was good for the theater. Again, I was trying to know my audience. The biggest issue I ran into was color grading. Some of these night scenes came out pretty grainy, so I bought this extension called Neat Video, which was there to remove noise. This worked okay in some instances, but it gave everything a really smooth, waxy look, and also crashed my laptop every 10 minutes and whenever I tried to render with it. It also created this weird artifacting at the side of the frame, and if I used it on 2 clips right next to each other, it created a short crossfade where the shots were burned together instead of appearing in a seamless, clean cut. I got around this by creating 2 video tracks and alternating between them for each clip, but it shouldn't be this much work. I also graded a lot of these dim scenes way too dark, so important details like eyes get lost in the shadows. In hindsight, what I should have done, and did during the recut, was just lean into the noise and imperfections. It was a Western after all, not Blade Runner 2049, and a little grain never hurt nobody. The point of this is that you shouldn't, and honestly can't, edit your footage into something that it's not. What we shot looked pretty good natively, and I ruined it with my poor understanding of grading and honestly just visuals in general. Shoot it right on set whenever you can, and embrace it in the edit. You'll almost never successfully try to hide what your movie actually is or looks like. Side note, actually, now that we're talking about editing, is that the free software Audacity is your best friend. It's actually owned and managed by a fellow YouTuber who I love, named Tantacruel. Sorry if I said your name wrong, but if you haven't already downloaded it, do so. It can't do everything, but for a free audio editor, it's pretty fantastic, and I still use it. But anyway, here's another big thing I learned on this movie. Don't set a release date unless you have to. After I wrote the script, I decided on the hard and fast release date of July 31st, 2019. Why? Well, a bunch of reasons, but the point is that I didn't have to do that. Now, did we have it all filmed both in that window? Oh yeah, easy. The issue was that the deadline didn't give me nearly enough time to actually finish properly editing it. I was so crunched for time I didn't even finish the first real cut of the movie, the 3.5 hour one for the cast, until 5 a.m. on the morning of our cast premiere, a day or two before the actual theatrical premiere. I got that bad boy rendering as the sun came up, went to bed, then got up around 10 or 11 that morning to get everything ready for the cast party, which was at my buddy's campground. Yes, the same place we'd had the Epitome showing. And big surprise, my laptop, which had a render success rate of about 50%, wasn't done with this monstrous file yet. So, I loaded all my stuff into my minivan, set my laptop gently on the floor, and brought it with me to the campground, praying that nothing would go wrong in transit. A few hours later, my cast and some VIP friends pulled up to the campground, and while we waited for it to get dark, we had what is sincerely one of the best days of my life. My friends made me a big card, they bought me a Blu-ray copy of Rango, we went swimming, we played hours of volleyball, we did some grilling, talked about the movie, and just... Well, there are times in life when you feel genuinely held by other people, when for whatever reason everything just clicks, and it's hard for you to imagine ever feeling sad or hurt again. And this was one of those days. And to top it all off, the render completed without error, at right about 9:30, like 10 minutes before the sun went down, and we could all boot up the projector. Just in time. But the rushing didn't stop after that. I was so pushed for time getting my final edit ready for the theater that I couldn't watch through the entire file. Don't do this, obviously. The result of my rushing was a missing clip that treated the audience to about 5 seconds of black screen halfway through the movie. The theatrical cut was also a nice family family-friendly PG-13, or at least it was supposed to be, while the extended cut was rated R for swearing. Well, in my rushing, there were a few F-bombs that slipped through in the finale and upset some more grandmas. So sometimes we learn, sometimes we don't. There was also a very harrowing and stressful night, I believe the night directly before the premiere, when me and my man Grady were at the movie theater until about 3 a.m., desperately trying to get the file into a playable format for the theater's projector. In the past, I had burned a Blu-ray disc, but that wasn't working this time, I think due to file size or something. So we tried all sorts of things before I eventually just uploaded the entire movie to YouTube, and Grady played it from his Blu-ray player, which was hooked up to the projector. This worked, but don't do it. If the internet dips or something, you're out of luck. You don't want an audience watching a screen buffer. Instead, if you have the opportunity to play your film at a local theater, do all of the following. First, burn a disc. Burn a Blu-ray and a DVD. Don't put a menu screen on your disc because some players will get stuck on it and it won't play the disc. I learned this on Never Look Up. You should also put it on a flash drive, like a little thumb drive type guy. Make it an MP4 file or something the Blu-ray player can actually read. I always say go with MP4. Try to do something else as well. Any kind of file type that you like, but always do an MP4. Do multiple kinds. Then put all of those also on an external hard drive. Format it as an MP4 file so something like a Blu-ray player can read it. Again, do the same thing as you did on a flash drive. Have it on multiple drives so that if something goes wrong with one, you have another option. And then, on top of all of that, upload the entire thing to YouTube. If you have a device you can plug into the projector, like a Blu-ray player, which will stream and play from YouTube. Just do all of this. Have a backup. Have 10 backups. Watch through your file before you play it as many times as you can. Test it at the theater weeks in advance. See what it sounds and looks like. It's going to look different on the projector screen than it does on your computer or your TV at home. You don't want to be at the theater until 3 a.m. praying to God that a miracle happens just so that your movie works. This is all obvious to anyone who's done it, but if it's your first time, yeah, trust me, you don't want to learn the hard way. But all of this really is about deadlines. Obviously, you need deadlines and release dates. If you can wait until the whole movie is done before you set a release date, absolutely do that. If you can't, then set your release date after it's done filming and you're partway through editing. This way, you've already worked your way through any potential large obstacles and should be ready to roll when the big day comes. You'll also be able to really find the best version of your movie to show people instead of just having to show people the version of your movie that happens to be done at the time. I've done this for all of my releases since Roses, and it really feels like it more than doubled the quality of my filmmaking. It also made me actually enjoy editing, which I used to absolutely loathe because it was always so rushed, cramped, and stressful. Your movie is your baby. Enjoy spending time with it. Let it breathe. Get to know it. Let it get to know you. Remember that sometimes your feverish 3 a.m. editing sessions will yield genius, and that sometimes it's good to look back at those edits with the benefit of sleep, daylight, and hindsight. But also, you gotta know when to let it go. Otherwise, you'll work on it forever. You can never fix everything. So halfway through editing, give yourself a deadline so you know when you have to let your baby go. It'll be hard, but you can do it. Like I mentioned earlier, No Parents kind of began a golden age for forgotten media, and Roses of the West continued it. I did go through a bit of a break in college though, largely due to a little something called COVID-19, meaning that we didn't make a new movie until the end of 2020. By then, I was in my 4th year of college, and most of my friends, old and new, were still spread out all over the state for college as well. Because of this, we returned to the tried and true technique of going from a big blockbuster to a really small, tight project to practice what we'd learned. After some fooling around and toying with different ideas, this led me to write a script adapting a short Stephen King story called Night Surf. A couple things led me to Night Surf. First, and maybe most importantly, it worked logistically. The whole story set on a beach, and at the time, there was a great public park/beach right down the road from my house. Second, I only needed a few characters, and I had the right amount of people pretty much right there in my college house with me. Third, it was topical. It was about a flu that killed off most of mankind. And finally, it was a nice little return to my roots, my first ever film having been a Stephen King adaptation. I also felt that it was fundamentally a story about loneliness, and there was a lot of loneliness in the world at that time, so it just kind of hit everything that I was looking for. But anyway, what I learned from Night Surf that I haven't already covered. Really, it was how to actually do slow motion. In my early films, I tried over and over again to have these epic, slow, intense climax scenes with dark music thundering over everything to make the viewer think, holy shit, this is epic. And of course, I almost always failed, and it came off as comical instead. But Night Surf was the first time that I actually felt like we nailed the final action. The movie ends with my character getting drowned by Jordan and Abby's characters, all filmed during a gloomy September blue hour and set to In the Woods Somewhere by Hosier. Because most of the actual action in the drowning technically takes place off camera, we didn't actually have to show too much of the hard part. It's shot from a distance, and when there are close-ups, they're simple. This makes the whole thing look and feel way more convincing because there's nothing that can really go wrong. So yeah, if you can't make it, just fake it. Or better yet, hide it. But why does Night Surf get to be in the peak category? Did it have a successfful theatrical showing? Did everyone forgive me for Never Look Up and come back to us in droves? Did the Roses of the West fans all show up to support Night Surf? No. Actually, Night Surf was a Sudafed-style flop that got dumped online and that no one saw. Actually, some people saw it on YouTube and bullied it, but whatever. I put it in the peak tier for all of the reasons I already covered, but also because whenever we do show this movie to someone, they always like it. Night Surf is consistently a fan favorite, and the things that make me really cringe are pretty minimal. The cast is good, the setting is good, and Night Surf has some of the most consistent vibes and atmosphere out of anything I've ever made before or since. It's also nice and short, moves at a great pace, and has some pretty neat visuals. And much like Choices, Night Surf set the stage for our next big production, which is one of my top 3 personal faves, Our Last and Only Summer. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one, because instead of learning new things, I did a lot of forgetting old ones. Much like Rose of the West, Our Last and Only Summer came out ungodly long. The first cut was, you guessed it, 3.5 hours, but when it came to the theatrical, I didn't mess around. 3 full hours. Boom! Unlike Roses though, I gave myself a more realistic deadline. So while we filmed it all in the summer of 2021, I didn't release until late fall, giving myself plenty of time to do that finding I talked about earlier. This meant that, despite taking a half an hour out of the movie, I felt pretty good about all the cuts. The shorter version was better, and I didn't lose anything essential. Could or should I have trimmed it down further still? Probably, but the point is I was pretty happy with the length. On the production end though, things were a little more rough. The weather was a constant problem, way too much rain, and unfortunately sometimes there's no backup plan when you want to film outside. I was also not quite at the top of my game when it came to being patient and flexible, so we saw some shades of the teenager who screamed at his friend to just fucking leave, come back for a few minutes, which I'm not proud of. There was also a terrible episode when he had a room full of necessary extras at the trusty old campground hanging around, who eventually sort of drifted off in ones and twos because they spent so much time waiting for us to be ready while we searched hopelessly for a missing piece of equipment. That was embarrassing. Have your shit together when you've got a crowd waiting on you. One cool thing we did learn and do for the first time here though was filming in a location that wasn't public or something we made. A pretty big chunk of Our Last and Only Summer was set in a pizza restaurant, and just like Rick Harrison, I had a buddy who was an expert in pizza places. Well, actually here's what happened. I was at work in the movie theater, talking to my buddy Scott about needing a pizza place to film at. He mentioned it to someone else who had a friend that was a manager at a local pizza place. That friend was actually my man Jack. Hi Jack, if you're watching. I know you have before. Who I also knew, though I hadn't connected the dots between he and the pizza place. So, through the grapevine, I got back in touch with my buddy. He hooked us up with the day the pizza place was closed, and we had the entire restaurant to ourselves for filming. The point of this is that you never know what circumstances might lead you to a place or person you need, so ask around and don't burn bridges. Also, take care of the people who help you out. Ask what you can do for them in return. Send them cards. Pay them if you can. Invite them to the theater. Send them a copy of your movie. Whatever you can do to show that you appreciate that person and are thankful for them. It goes a long way. But anyway, we had a theatrical showing for Our Last and Only Summer, our first in 2 years, and, you know, not very many people showed up. It was a pretty small crowd. But everyone who was there liked it. A bunch of them cried too, which is epic. That's what you want. And all of our playback options worked the first time with no technical errors. I consider Our Last and Only Summer a peak era because, well, a lot of the things going on behind the camera were a fumble on my end, but what we got on camera is pretty fantastic. I think this is the best acting from almost everyone in Forgotten Media, and everyone looks their best in this movie too, which is also important. And I just like the script, story, and vibes. The villain is an incel domestic terrorist type guy, and when I revisited this movie a few months ago, I was worried that he wouldn't hold up or might be goofy, but instead, the more time passes, and the more I learn about these type of people in real life, the more I stand by him as a villain, and the more realistic his motivations are, and the more relevant he seems. Which, finally, brings us to 2023, and the release of our most recent movie, Nothing More Than Ghosts. This is one that, honestly, and for the sake of time, I can't extrapolate into being full of new lessons or morals. Instead, I'm proud of Nothing More Than Ghosts, and consider it in the peak tier of my work because it's a fantastic culmination of everything I had learned up to this point. So, let's take a look. First, the story and script. Not my most straightforward script, this one kind of blends the weird surrealism of No Parents with the more mature self-reflection and self-loathing of Night Surf, Roses, and Our Last and Only Summer. But still, every character has something to do without devoting too much time to them and bogging down the pacing. There's a clear structure, and things are always moving forward. At just over 2 hours, it is a bit long for horror, but it's not a 3-hour snooze fest like I've done in the past. But anyway, everyone had something to do. We did practicing and auditions, like, for weeks before we started filming, and everyone was pretty well acquainted with what was going on. Sets, just like with Roses, we built a new one by cleaning out an old creepy shed. Thank you again, people who collect junk. Costumes, a lot of time and work went into this. On a small budget, sometimes it's good to just pick one thing to really focus on and then go crazy with it. I guess that's one of the things I learned on this, because Brooke, who plays one of the villains and had been around since No Parents, sank hours into making all these creepy animal masks for the monsters to wear. And this was obviously everyone's favorite part of the whole thing. It really pays to pick one thing and just sort of knock it out of the park, instead of trying to do 100 things and fail at all of them, like it did with Never Look Up. Actual filming went great. Pretty well organized, almost enough time, plenty of food, solid schedule. Of course, people show up late and things take long, but man, filming this movie was fun, especially in these bigger scenes that have so many people on set. It was so cool having everyone out in this field, wandering around with old farm tools, taking pictures, and wearing robes. It was definitely the most surreal and atmospheric set I've ever been on, and honestly, was pretty creepy at points, which I think translated really well to the final project. It's one of those things that I can hardly even conceptualize as having been real, just like showing epitome to the audience or walking into our finished saloon on Roses for the first time. I don't know, it just all clicked, and I'm proud of the creativity we used too. For example, a lot of my early night scenes in past films looked awful because the light source is completely unmotivated and just sort of follows the characters around. On Nothing More Than Ghosts, though, I bought one of those LED ring lights with a stand, and we raised the stand up to full height. Then my buddy, David, stuck it on the top of his backpack and ran around like it was the moon. Was it the best or most professional way to do this? No, but it's better than,
Andy! You should have never let him go.
We also made this weird display for our monsters, so it looked like the actress, shout out to Sophie, was growing out of the ground, which was fun. We had also used just a little bit of drone action in our last Only Summer and busted that bad boy back out for quite a few shots in this, which I think added a lot to the production value. The multicam setup from Roses came back for a few scenes, and we talked to another business about using their facility, this time a bar, and honestly, nothing beats just using a real location. We did have one potential location issue with this corn maze, though. This was another friend of a friend type of find, and even though we tried contacting them several times, they never answered. So the 2016 director of Epitome came back out, and we just sort of showed up with our gear and costumes. I had no idea what happened, but I did ask permission, and they said, yeah, okay, right there on the spot. So again, it pays to ask. Showing up like you were already told yes might help, but yeah, always ask. When you can. Then we got to do something we had done in other films, but which I hadn't covered yet, which was some good old-fashioned short indoor scenes that weren't high stakes or time sensitive. For as fun as it is to have 20 people on set and be running around with drones and fog machines and guns and blood, sometimes it's nice to have 2 or 3 people on a couch and find the most creative way possible to shoot something that's just kind of normal and basic. Scenes like this give you a lot more time and room to experiment with settings on your camera and other things because people aren't waiting on you as much. They also form the connective tissue of your movie, and it's important to make your audience enjoy them instead of just waiting for the next big thing. These are good for actors, too, because then they can really take the time to try things in different ways and multiple different takes that they might not have the time for during big fights or group scenes. So, I don't know. I guess my point is, don't rush through the little scenes to get to the big ones. If you think a scene is boring, cut it out. If you can't cut it out, make it interesting. Again, it's pretty much exclusively your job to pick the right tools to make even the most basic scene or moment as interesting or engaging as possible. And this isn't just up to what's on camera either. Think long and hard about how you want the scene to sound, how you want it to feel. I used a lot of rain sounds in this movie because I felt it added to these small moments inside and pushed the characters and viewer closer together. And again, none of these are new tricks or techniques. They're just things that you might not necessarily know or try until you've, well, known or tried them. If that makes sense. Release-wise, I gave myself months to edit this movie, and it really paid off. We dropped it into the theater at the beginning of December, and actually had a pretty good turnout. People really liked it too, especially the masks. This is in my top 3 fave projects, and it's a pretty big fave pick for a lot of other Forgotten Media members too. I bring this all up, especially in relation to our last Only Summer, to highlight that if you do screw up, if you do forget a few lessons here and there, it's not the end of the world, or at least it doesn't have to be. You can always come back. Every failure, or every flop, is a new opportunity to learn, or grow, or change. One of the things my videography professor told me in college that I've never forgotten is that if you look back at your old work and don't cringe a little, it means you haven't grown as an artist. It's okay, healthy even, to want to change things about your old work. What's not healthy is getting caught up in those mistakes and quitting. Instead, look back with a critical but fair lens and apply what happened to you when you were younger to what you want to be when you're older. My approach to this video has been to somewhat marry my filmmaking experience to my growing up experience. I know that's not for everyone, but for me, the best part of making movies isn't choosing lenses or placing cameras or even writing scripts. It's the moments in between. It's the moments after, the moments before. The scary and confusing cycle of time that sees people and passions and problems and ideas pop in and out of your life and make you who you are. Because I love movies, because I make movies, I have this incredible record of my life going back a decade that connects who I was to who I am. And in another decade, I'll have a record of who I am connecting me to who I was. With every new project, with every new skill, and every new mistake, I have a new memory. I have a new moment that freezes me and my friends in time and never lets us go. I can never return to who I used to be. My friends can never return to who they were. And on top of that, we can never return to who we were together. But honestly, it's taken me a long time to figure this out. You shouldn't always want to return to who you were before. There's a reason you left that person, that story, and that series of mistakes in the past. With all of that said, sometimes it is nice to go back and say hello. Not just to who you were, but to the people who maybe aren't around anymore. To the places that you can't just walk into like you did when you were 16. The little moments that you would forget if they weren't frozen in time for you. Sometimes when you're doubting who you are now and what you're capable of, it's important and necessary to look back at what you were and remember how far you've come. Because if the same person who did what you did then can do what you do now, then imagine how much more the person you'll be is capable of. Imagine who you'll have there to help you. Imagine what you'll accomplish together. Imagine what you'll learn. Imagine the fun you'll have, the memories you'll make, the stories you'll tell. Imagine the things that you don't think will happen, that can't happen, that seem like they would have to be another person's life or another person's dream. And then, I want you to imagine those things happening. Because someday, they will. They did for me. To get started, all you've got to do is hit record. And of course, say action.
Action!
Thank you. You saved me.
Saved each other.
We saved each other.
Good.